polyvictimization and opioid use among jailed women in New Hampshire, an application of GST. The data that I'm going to be sharing with you today is the first step in a larger study that I participated in with Dr. Barlow. In this project, we're investigating whether social support networks have an impact on coping with sexual trauma and domestic violence among jailed women in New England. This research is partially funded by New Hampshire INBRI, which is a program funded by the National Institute of Health to support biomedical research for faculty and students in New Hampshire colleges and universities. Our focus is on jailed women in rural county jails because we're learning that the jailed population is slightly different from the larger prison population. Many of the women in county jails have not been to prison, but unless they get some significant help dealing with trauma and drug abuse, they will probably end up in prison. We want to know what factors most impact the intensity of their drug use, which is typically what links women to their criminal justice system involvement. One of the areas most interesting to me is the specific focus on substance use, especially various opioids, including heroin and fentanyl, and their relationship with trauma. As some of you may know, New Hampshire has the second highest rate of opioid-related overdose deaths in the country, nearly 500 in 2017, with a slight decrease in 2018 to about 410, all in a state with a little over 1 million residents. It's well established that there is a strong correlation between women's offending and their experiences with trauma. Incarcerated women are frequently found to have experienced trauma and have drug abuse disorders more so than incarcerated men. A 2005 study with 100 female jail inmates found that 90% reported intimate partner violence experiences, and between 50 and 72% reported some type of childhood sexual assault. A needs assessment by Wolf et al. In 2011 found that 87% of the women in their sample were classified as having a substance use disorder. Data from the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women found that when compared to men, women have higher rates of co-occurring disorders. For example, someone might have a substance use disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as some other mental illness. Additionally, women have an earlier and greater onset of disorders related to a substance use disorder. In addition to conducting qualitative interviews in which we asked detailed questions about substance use and significant traumas, we also used several well-established scales and indices, including the Drug History and Severity Questionnaire, the Trauma Life History Questionnaire, and the PTSD Civilian Checklist, also called the PLCC. Our pilot site was the Cheshire County Department of Corrections, here in Cheshire County, New Hampshire. In 2018, the CCDOC housed, on average, about 26 women throughout the year. So while our sample size of 20 might seem small, it's very representative of the female population incarcerated at CCDOC. Let's first look at the participant demographics. The majority of our respondents were between the ages of 30 and 49. They identified primarily as white, although 4 women self-identified as biracial. Those results are largely representative of the general racial composition of New Hampshire. The majority of our respondents had received at least a high school diploma or gotten their GED. 63.1% were in some sort of serious relationship, marital or otherwise, at the time of their incarceration. And almost 70% of the women that we interviewed had children. Now, let's take a look at drug use among this population. Almost all of our respondents reported that they had used some type of illicit substance in the year or so prior to coming to CCDOC. I've highlighted in red the ones that are most pertinent to this study. We'll be looking at cocaine or crack in any form, which 68.4% of the respondents indicated that they had used. 63.2% said that they had used prescription opiates such as Oxy or Vicodin. 63.2% indicated that they had used heroin or fentanyl in the year or so prior to their incarceration. 63.2% also said that they had used methadone or Suboxone other than as prescribed for addiction treatment. And finally, 73.7% of our respondents said that they had used these substances either in combination with each other or with alcohol. 10.5% of our respondents indicated that they had used bath salts, which were not initially included in our analysis, but what we learned through the in-person interviews with women who had used bath salts is that they're among the most addictive substances and one of the worst that a person can take. One woman that had used bath salts prior to becoming incarcerated was detoxing in jail and had to take a shower, and the bath salts were still in her system, and the hot water chemically reactivated some of the bath salts, and she actually got chemical burns on her feet as the water ran down her body, so really bad. We asked about substance use history, including at what age she began using, the context under which she first started using, who introduced her to harder drugs, as well as the age at which she began to abuse substances. We asked the respondents whether they used each substance at all and how regularly, and whether they swallowed, sniffed, smoked, or injected each of these substances. From these data, we created a total substance use score that includes the total number of substance categories used within the last year. This has been done in a few other studies, but in early analyses, we're finding that this score, the total number of substances used, might not be the best indicator of addiction for our population, since there are some very heavy users that only use one drug, like heroin, for example. So we also created a drug use intensity score that considers the intensity of drug use, even if the user is only using one or two substances. And here are some of the categories of trauma that we asked about. These data were gathered using a trauma history questionnaire, which is essentially a life history calendar asking about the prevalence of these events throughout the women's lives. Almost all of the women that we interviewed have experienced some type of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. The types of trauma in red are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on here today. We'll be looking at instances of child rape, forced sex under the age of 14, 50% respond that they had experienced that. The age of 14 has been used in prior trauma studies to differentiate between childhood and adulthood, so we kept with that tradition in this study. We'll be looking at molestation under the age of 14, of which 35% of our respondents indicated that they had experienced. 75% said that they had experienced rape as an adult. 78% reported adult sexual assault. 50% had been abused physically as a child. And 75% had been victimized by intimate partner violence. The measures that I'm going to use today include the drug use intensity score, the child sexual abuse score, combining both the categories of child rape and molestation under the age of 14, whether they experienced physical abuse as a child, experiences of adult rape or sexual assault, as well as adult intimate partner violence. We also created a polyvictimization or cumulative trauma score, which is the total number of trauma categories a woman has experienced in her lifetime. And finally, we created a loss variable, which indicates whether a woman has suffered a significant loss in her life, including the traumatic death of a loved one, losing custody of her children, or becoming homeless. Now for the theoretical part. Agnew's general strain theory, the GST, is based on the general idea that when people are treated badly, they may get upset and engage in crime or deviance. This theory was initially developed with adolescents and delinquent behaviors in mind, but since this theory has been applied to all manners of deviance and criminality throughout the life course. Agnew argues that there are three main things that can induce strain. The first is the failure to achieve one's positively valued goals. His original examples of those are money, status or respect, and autonomy. He also theorized that the removal of positive stimuli would create strain in an individual. This could be losing a loved one, getting a divorce, undergoing a significant move. Lastly, Agnew suggests that the presentation of negative stimuli is also strain-inducing. Negative stimuli examples include any form of abuse or dealing with a mental illness and things like that. Strain is most likely to result in some type of deviance or negative coping when it's greater in magnitude, greater in duration, as well as more recent. For this application of GST, I'm going to be focusing on the impact of presentation of negative stimuli and the removal of positive stimuli on intensity of drug use. I'm also going to measure the recency of the trauma and how the duration of the trauma impacts intensity of drug use. My first hypothesis is that the presentation of negative stimuli, those who experienced sexual or physical abuse, will be correlated with a higher drug use intensity score. Second, the removal of positive stimuli, those who lost custody of their children, were homeless, or experienced the traumatic death of a loved one, will be correlated with higher drug use intensity scores. Next, I hypothesized that polyvictimization, those experiencing traumas from multiple categories, will be correlated with higher drug use intensity scores. This is my measure of duration. And fourth, I hypothesized that traumas occurring in adulthood, those that are more recent, will be correlated with higher drug use intensity scores. This one is the measure of recency. An independent samples t-test is a statistical analysis that determines whether the average for each category is statistically significantly different for each group. So first, let's look at whether those who have experienced childhood sexual abuse have higher drug intensity scores than those who have not experienced CSA. As you can see, those who have experienced CSA, their average drug intensity score was 4.33, as compared to those who have not experienced childhood sexual abuse, their mean drug intensity score was 3.40. While these scores are different, the difference is not quite large enough for it to be statistically significantly different from the possibility that this difference could occur by chance out in the real world. However, when we look at child physical abuse, those who have experienced it have an average drug intensity score of 4.8, compared to those who have not experienced childhood physical abuse, and that category had a drug intensity average of 3.40. This difference is statistically significantly different, and I've highlighted that statistic in red. When we look at adult sexual assault or intimate partner violence, we can again see a difference in their mean drug intensity scores. However, neither of those differences were statistically significantly different. Next, we're going to look at the second hypothesis, which is whether those who have had the removal of positive stimuli will have higher drug use intensity scores. And as we can see, those who have experienced these types of traumatic losses have a very high drug intensity use score when compared to those who have not experienced these types of losses. So this difference in score is statistically significantly different. Next, we're testing hypothesis 3, that those experiencing traumas from multiple categories will be correlated with higher drug use intensity scores. And here, because of the way that we structured polyvictimization, we can't use an independent samples t-test. What I've chosen to use here instead is a Pearson's correlation to measure the strength of the correlation between polyvictimization and drug use intensity. A Pearson's correlation score of a 0.5 indicates a moderately strong correlation. As we can see here, the score is 0.498, so almost a 0.5, and this difference is statistically significant. There's a moderately strong correlation between the number of trauma categories one experiences and the intensity of their drug use. Now, what this does not tell us is whether polyvictimization causes increased drug use. It just lets us know that these two things are related. Dr. Barlow explained that I would need to perform a linear regression to determine if these variables actually have an impact on each other, to make sure that this correlation was not happening by chance. To do that, I would need a slightly larger sample size than I have right now, but she imagines that I would find a statistically significant increase in drug use intensity for every X increase in the number of victimization categories. So again, this measure does not determine causality, only association, but they are moderately strongly associated. For the last hypothesis, the recency of traumas, we looked at whether traumas in adulthood or traumas in childhood are more strongly associated with drug use intensity. And here we also used a Pearson's correlation, just like in the last slide, measuring only correlation, not causation. When we look at the number of years since the last trauma, there's almost no correlation at all with drug use intensity. The score is 0.020, a score of 0.0 indicates no correlation. When we look at adulthood traumas, this is slightly correlated with drug use intensity with a score of 0.382, but it is not statistically significant. However, when we look at those who have experienced childhood traumas, we see that the correlation between drug use intensity is moderately strong, approaching a pretty strong, statistically significant relationship. So unlike Agnew's claim that more recent traumas will be more likely to be associated with deviance, I actually found the opposite, that childhood trauma in this sample are more strongly associated with increased drug use. So to recap all of that, overall, I found moderate support for the introduction of negative stimuli resulting in increased drug use intensity, but only for the presentation of childhood physical abuse. I found strong support for the loss of positive stimuli being correlated with an increase in drug use intensity. I also identified a moderately strong correlation between polyvictimization and drug use intensity. the more categories or types of victimization that one has experienced, the greater their intensity of drug use. Finally, I did not find support for the recency of traumas being correlated with drug use intensity. Traumas occurring during childhood were more strongly correlated with increases in drug use intensity. Many other researchers have found a correlation between recency of trauma and the likelihood of engaging in deviance to relieve strain. So it's very important to understand that none of the findings that I've talked about today can be generalized into a larger population. This is such a unique population and a very small sample size. Most of our participants had some level of drug use, and most of them have experienced multiple types of traumas. Without having a comparison group, it's difficult to identify which of these variables can really be used to predict increases in drug use. And even in the best predictive models that Dr. Barlow ran, these traumas only explained about 40% of the variation in drug use intensity scores. So it may be that other factors increase drug use intensity, such as having drug-using family, friends, significant others, the region of the country that you live in, level of self-control, your access to getting illicit substances, as well as protective factors like positive support networks, access to mental health, access to therapy. Those could decrease the likelihood of relieving strain through substance use. This is an ongoing project, so we'll be evaluating the impact of these additional factors in the future. So, thanks for coming out, and I'll take questions if you have any.